The 5 Orange Pips. When I review my notes and records of Sherlock Holmes's cases between 1882 and 1890, I'm confronted by so many strange and intriguing events that it's difficult to choose which ones to share and which to leave behind. Some have already gained notoriety in the papers, while others haven't offered the proper scope for showcasing my friend's unique talents. The very talents this collection of papers aims to illustrate. Some cases baffled his analytical skills, leaving them as unfinished narratives, while others were only partially solved, their explanations relying more on conjecture and supposition than the absolute logical proof he held dear. However, one case from this period stands out, so remarkable in its details and startling in its results, that I'm compelled to recount it, despite the fact that certain aspects remain, and probably will forever remain, shrouded in mystery. The year 1887 provided us with a long string of cases, varying in interest, which I've documented. Among my entries for those 12 months, I find an account of the adventure of the Paradol Chamber, the amateur mendicant society, who operated a luxurious club in the lower vault of a furniture warehouse, the facts surrounding the loss of the British bark Sophie Anderson, the singular adventures of the Grice Pattersons on the island of Uffa, and, finally, the Camberwell poisoning case. In the latter, as you may recall, Sherlock Holmes was able, by winding up the dead man's watch, to prove that it had been wound up 2 hours before, indicating that the deceased had gone to bed within that time frame, a deduction crucial to solving the case. I may sketch out these other cases at some future date, but none of them possess the singular features of the bizarre chain of events I'm about to describe. It was in the latter days of September, and the equinoctial gales had set in with exceptional force. All day the wind had howled, and the rain had battered against the windows, even here in the heart of London, forcing us to momentarily abandon the routine of life and acknowledge the presence of those powerful, elemental forces that shriek at humankind through the bars of civilization like untamed beasts in a cage. As evening descended, the storm intensified, the wind crying and sobbing like a child in the chimney. Sherlock Holmes sat moodily by the fireplace, cross-indexing his records of crime, while I, on the other side, was engrossed in one of Clark Russell's captivating sea stories. The howl of the gale outside seemed to blend with the text, the splash of rain echoing the long swash of ocean waves. My wife was visiting her mother, and for a few days, I found myself back in my old quarters at Baker Street. "Why?" I said, glancing up at my companion. "That was surely the bell. Who could possibly be calling at this hour?" "Except yourself. I have none," he answered. "I don't encourage visitors." "A client, then?" "If so, it's a serious case. Nothing less would bring a man out on such a day and at such an hour. But I take it that it's more likely to be some crony of the landlady's." Sherlock Holmes was wrong, however, as a step echoed in the passage, followed by a tap at the door. He stretched out his long arm, turning the lamp away from himself and towards the vacant chair where the newcomer would sit. "Come in," he said. The man who entered was young, no more than 22, well-groomed and impeccably dressed, with a hint of refinement and delicacy in his bearing. The streaming umbrella he held in his hand, and his long, shiny raincoat spoke of the fierce weather he'd braved. He looked around anxiously in the glare of the lamp, and I could see his face was pale, his eyes heavy, as if burdened by some deep anxiety. "I owe you an apology," he said, raising his golden pince-nez to his eyes. "I trust I'm not intruding. I fear I've brought some traces of the storm and rain into your cozy chamber." "Give me your coat and umbrella," Holmes said. "They may rest here on the hook and will be dry presently. You've come up from the southwest, I see." "Yes, from Horsham." That clay and chalk mixture I see upon your toe caps is quite distinctive. I have come for advice. That is easily obtained. And help. That is not always so easy. I have heard of you, Mr. Holmes. I heard from Major Prendergast how you saved him in the Tankerville Club scandal. Ah, of course. He was wrongly accused of cheating at cards. He said that you could solve anything. He said too much, that you are never beaten. I have been beaten 4 times, 3 times by men, and once by a woman. But what is that compared to the number of your successes? It is true that I have been generally successful. Then you may be so with me. I beg that you will draw your chair up to the fire and favor me with some details as to your case. It is no ordinary one. None of those which come to me are, I am the last court of appeal. And yet I question, sir, whether, in all your experience, you have ever listened to a more mysterious and inexplicable chain of events than those which have happened in my own family. You fill me with interest, Holmes said. Pray give us the essential facts from the commencement, and I can afterwards question you as to those details which seem to me to be most important. The young man pulled his chair closer and extended his wet feet towards the blaze. My name, he said, is John Openshaw, but my own affairs have, as far as I can understand, little to do with this awful business. It is a hereditary matter, so in order to give you an idea of the facts, I must go back to the beginning. You must know that my grandfather had 2 sons, my uncle Elias and my father Joseph. My father had a small factory at Coventry, which he enlarged at the time of the invention of the bicycle. He was a patent holder of the Openshaw unbreakable tire, and his business met with such success that he was able to sell it and retire with a handsome fortune. My uncle Elias emigrated to America when he was a young man and became a planter in Florida, where he was reported to have done very well. At the time of the war, he fought in Jackson's army, and afterwards under Hood, where he rose to the rank of colonel. When Lee surrendered, my uncle returned to his plantation, where he remained for 3 or 4 years. Around 1869 or 1870, he returned to Europe and took a small estate in Sussex near Horsham. He had made a considerable fortune in the States, and his reason for leaving was his aversion to the Negroes and his dislike of the Republican policy of extending the franchise to them. He was a singular man, fierce and quick-tempered, foul-mouthed when angry, and of a most reclusive disposition. During all the years he lived at Horsham, I doubt if he ever set foot in the town. He had a garden and 2 or 3 fields around his house, and there he would take his exercise, though very often for weeks on end he would never leave his room. He drank a great deal of brandy and smoked heavily, but he would see no society and didn't want any friends, not even his own brother. He didn't mind me. In fact, he took a liking to me. I was about 12 years old when I first met him. This would have been in 1878, after he had been 8 or 9 years in England. He begged my father to let me live with him, and he was very kind to me in his own way. When he was sober, he used to enjoy playing backgammon and draughts with me, and he made me his representative with the servants and tradespeople, so that by the time I was 16, I was practically the master of the house. I kept all the keys and could go wherever I liked and do whatever I liked, as long as I didn't disturb him in his privacy. There was one singular exception, however. He had a single room, a lumber room up among the attics, which was invariably locked, and which he would never permit either me or anyone else to enter. With a boy's curiosity, I've peeped through the keyhole, but I was never able to see more than the kind of old trunks and bundles you'd expect in such a room. One day, it was in March, 1883, a letter with a foreign stamp lay on the table in front of the colonel's plate. It wasn't common for him to receive letters, as he paid all his bills in cash, and had no friends to speak of. "From India," he said, picking it up. "Pondicherry postmark. What can this be?" Opening it hurriedly, out there jumped 5 little dried orange pips, which pattered down upon his plate. I began to laugh, but the laughter died on my lips at the sight of his face. His lip had fallen, his eyes were bulging, his skin the color of putty, and he glared at the envelope he still held in his trembling hand. "KKK," he shrieked, and then, my God, my sins have overtaken me." "What is it, Uncle?" I cried. "Death," he said, and rising from the table, he retired to his room, leaving me trembling with terror. I picked up the envelope and saw scrawled in red ink upon the inner flap, just above the gum, the letter K repeated 3 times. There was nothing else, just the 5 dried pips. What could be the reason for his overwhelming terror? I left the breakfast table, and as I ascended the stairs, I met him coming down, an old rusty key, which must have belonged to the attic, in one hand, and a small brass box, like a cash box, in the other. "They may do what they like, but I'll checkmate them still," he said with an oath. "Tell Mary I shall want a fire in my room today, and send down to Fordham, the Horsham lawyer." I did as he ordered, and when the lawyer arrived, I was asked to step up to the room. The fire was burning brightly, and in the grate there was a mass of black, fluffy ashes as of burned paper, while the brass box stood open and empty beside it. As I glanced at the box, I noticed with a start that upon the lid was printed the treble K, which I had read that morning on the envelope. "I wish you, John," my uncle said, "to witness my will. I leave my estate, with all its advantages and all its disadvantages, to my brother, your father, whence it will, no doubt, descend to you. If you can enjoy it in peace, well and good. If you find you cannot, take my advice, my boy, and leave it to your deadliest enemy. I am sorry to give you such a two-edged thing, but I can't say what turn things are going to take. Kindly sign the paper where Mr. Fordham shows you." I signed the paper as directed, and the lawyer took it away with him. This singular incident, as you can imagine, made a deep impression on me. I pondered over it and turned it over in my mind, but I couldn't make sense of it. Yet, I couldn't shake off the vague feeling of dread it left behind, though the sensation grew less intense as the weeks passed, and nothing happened to disrupt the usual routine of our lives. I could see a change in my uncle, however. He drank more than ever, and he was less inclined for any kind of company. Most of his time he would spend in his room, with the door locked from the inside, but sometimes he would emerge in a kind of drunken frenzy and burst out of the house, tearing around the garden with a revolver in his hand, screaming out that he was afraid of no man, and that he was not to be cooped up like a sheep in a pen by man or devil. When these fits passed, however, he would rush tumultuously back in at the door, locking and barring it behind him, like a man who can no longer hold back the terror that gnaws at his soul. At such times, I've seen his face, even on a cold day, glisten with sweat, as if it were newly lifted from a basin. Well, to come to an end of the matter, Mr. Holmes, and not to exhaust your patience, there came a night when he made one of those drunken sallies from which he never returned. We found him, when we went to search for him, face down in a small green-scummed pool at the bottom of the garden. There was no sign of any violence, and the water was only 2 feet deep, so that the jury, considering his known eccentricity, brought in a verdict of suicide. But I, who knew how he recoiled from even the thought of death, had a hard time convincing myself that he'd gone out of his way to meet it. The matter was settled, however, and my father took possession of the estate and some £14,000, which lay to his credit at the bank. "One moment," Holmes interjected. "Your statement is, I foresee, one of the most remarkable to which I have ever listened. Let me have the date of the reception of the letter by your uncle, and the date of his supposed suicide. The letter arrived on March 10, 1883. His death was 7 weeks later, on the night of May 2nd. Thank you. Pray proceed. When my father took over the Horsham property, he, at my request, made a careful examination of the attic, which had always been locked up. We found the brass box there, although its contents had been destroyed. On the inside of the cover was a paper label with the initials KKKK repeated upon it, and letters, memoranda, receipts, and a register written beneath. These, we presume, indicated the nature of the papers that had been destroyed by Colonel Openshaw. For the rest, there was nothing of much importance in the attic, save a great many scattered papers and notebooks pertaining to my uncle's life in America. Some of them were from the wartime and showed that he had done his duty well and had the reputation of a brave soldier. Others were from a date during the reconstruction of the southern states and were mostly concerned with the politics, for he had evidently taken a strong part in opposing the carpetbag politicians who had been sent down from the north. Well, it was the beginning of '84 when my father came to live at Horsham, and all went as well as possible with us until the January of '85. On the 4th day after the New Year, I heard my father give a sharp cry of surprise as we sat together at the breakfast table. There he was, sitting with a newly opened envelope in one hand and 5 dried orange pips in the outstretched palm of the other. He had always laughed at what he called my cock and bull story about the colonel, but he looked very scared and puzzled now that the same thing had happened to him. "Why, what on earth does this mean, John?" he stammered. My heart had turned to lead. "It is KKK," I said. He looked inside the envelope. "So it is," he cried. "Here are the very letters. But what is this written above them?" "Put the papers on the sundial," I read, peering over his shoulder. "What papers? What sundial?" he asked. "The sundial in the garden. There is no other," I said. "But the papers must be those that are destroyed." "Pooh," he said, gripping hard at his courage. "We are in a civilized land here, and we can't have tomfoolery of this kind. Where does this thing come from?" "From Dundee," I answered, glancing at the postmark. "Some preposterous practical joke," he said. "What have I to do with sundials and papers? I shall take no notice of such nonsense." "I should certainly speak to the police," I said, "and be laughed at for my pains. Nothing of the sort." "Then let me do so?" "No, I forbid you. I won't have a fuss made about such nonsense." It was in vain to argue with him, for he was a very obstinate man. I went about, however, with a heart full of foreboding. On the 3rd day after the coming of the letter, my father went from home to visit an old friend of his, Major Freebody, who is in command of one of the forts upon Portsdown Hill. I was glad that he should go, for it seemed to me that he was farther from danger when he was away from home. In that, however, I was mistaken. On the 2nd day of his absence, I received a telegram from the Major, imploring me to come at once. My father had fallen over one of the deep chalk pits which abound in the neighborhood, and was lying unconscious, with a shattered skull. I hurried to him, but he passed away without having ever regained consciousness. He had, as it appears, been returning from Fareham in the twilight, and as the country was unknown to him, and the chalk pit unfenced, the jury had no hesitation in bringing in a verdict of death from accidental causes. Carefully, as I examined every fact connected with his death, I was unable to find anything which could suggest the idea of murder. There were no signs of violence, no footprints, no robbery, no record of strangers having been seen on the roads. And yet, I need not tell you that my mind was far from at ease, and I was almost certain that some foul plot had been woven around him. In this sinister way, I came into my inheritance. You will ask me why I did not dispose of it. I answer because I was well convinced that our troubles were in some way dependent upon an incident in my uncle's life, and that the danger would be as pressing in one house as in another. It was in January, '85, that my poor father met his end, and 2 years and 8 months have elapsed since then. During that time I have lived happily at Horsham, and I had begun to hope that this curse had passed away from the family and that it had ended with the last generation. I had begun to take comfort too soon, however. Yesterday morning, the blow fell in the very same form as it had come upon my father. The young man took a crumpled envelope from his waistcoat and, turning to the table, shook out 5 little dried orange pips. "This is the envelope," he continued. "The postmark is London Eastern Division. Within are the very words that were on my father's last message, KKK. And then put the papers on the sundial." "What have you done?" Holmes asked. "Nothing." "Nothing?" "To tell the truth," he said, burying his face in his thin white hands, "I have felt helpless. I have felt like one of those poor rabbits when the snake is writhing towards it. I seem to be in the grasp of some resistless, inexorable evil, which no foresight or precautions can guard against." "Tut! Tut!" cried Sherlock Holmes. "You must act, man, or you are lost. Nothing but energy can save you. This is no time for despair. I have seen the police." "Ah!" But they listened to my story with a smile. "I am convinced that the inspector has formed the opinion that the letters are all practical jokes, and that the deaths of my relations were really accidents, as the jury stated, and were not to be connected with the warnings." Holmes shook his clenched hands in the air. "Incredible imbecility!" he cried. "They have, however, allowed me a policeman, who may remain in the house with me. Has he come with you tonight?" "No, his orders were to stay in the house." Again Holmes raved in the air. "Why did you come to me?" he said, "and, above all, why did you not come at once?" "I did not know. It was only today that I spoke to Major Prendergast about my troubles and was advised by him to come to you. It is really 2 days since you had the letter. We should have acted before this. You have no further evidence, I suppose, than that which you have placed before us? No suggestive detail which might help us?" "There is one thing," John Openshaw said. He rummaged in his coat pocket and, drawing out a piece of discolored, blue-tinted paper, he laid it out on the table. "I have some remembrance," he said, "that on the day when my uncle burned the papers, I observed that the small unburned margins which lay amid the ashes were of this particular color. I found this single sheet on the floor of his room, and I am inclined to think that it may be one of the papers that has perhaps fluttered out from among the others, and, in that way, has escaped destruction. Beyond the mention of pips, I don't see that it helps us much. I think myself that it is a page from some private diary. The writing is undoubtedly my uncle's." Holmes moved the lamp, and we both bent over the sheet of paper, which showed by its ragged edge that it had indeed been torn from a book. It was headed March, 1869, and beneath were the following enigmatic notices. 4th. Hudson came. Same old platform. 7th. Set the pips on Macaulay, Paramore, and John Swain of St. Augustine. 9th. Macaulay cleared. 10th. John Swain cleared. 12th. Visited Paramore. All well. "Thank you," Holmes said, folding up the paper and returning it to our visitor. "And now you must on no account lose another instant. We cannot spare time even to discuss what you have told me. You must get home instantly and act. What shall I do?" "There is but one thing to do. It must be done at once. You must put this piece of paper which you have shown us into the brass box which you have described. You must also put in a note to say that all the other papers were burned by your uncle, and that this is the only one which remains. You must assert that in such words as will carry conviction with them. Having done this, you must at once put the box out upon the sundial as directed. Do you understand?" Entirely. Do not think of revenge or anything of the sort at present. I think that we may gain that by means of the law, but we have our web to weave, while theirs is already woven. The first consideration is to remove the pressing danger which threatens you. The second is to clear up the mystery, and to punish the guilty parties. "I thank you," said the young man, rising and pulling on his overcoat. "You have given me fresh life and hope. I shall certainly do as you advise. Do not lose an instant, and above all, take care of yourself in the meantime, for I do not think there can be a doubt that you are threatened by a very real and imminent danger. How do you go back? By train from Waterloo. It is not yet 9. The streets will be crowded, so I trust that you may be in safety. And yet, you cannot guard yourself too closely. I am armed." "That is well. Tomorrow I shall set to work upon your case." "I shall see you at Horsham, then?" "No, your secret lies in London. It is there that I shall seek it. Then I shall call upon you in a day, or in 2 days, with news as to the box and the papers. I shall take your advice in every particular." He shook hands with us and took his leave. Outside the wind still screamed, and the rain splashed and pattered against the windows. This strange, wild story seemed to have come to us from amid the mad elements, blown in upon us like a sheet of seaweed in a gale, and now to have been reabsorbed by them once more. Sherlock Holmes sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. After a while he lit his pipe, leaned back, and watched the blue smoke curl upwards. "Watson," he finally said, "of all our cases, this one surpasses all others in its sheer strangeness. Except perhaps the sign of 4. True, perhaps that one. Yet this John Openshaw seems to be walking a path of even greater peril than the Sholtos. But have you," I asked, "any concrete idea about the nature of this danger?" "There's no room for doubt about its nature," he replied. "Then what is it? Who is this KKK? And why are they pursuing this unfortunate family?" Holmes closed his eyes, resting his fingertips together. "The ideal reasoner," he said, "observing a single fact in all its complexity, should deduce not only the chain of events leading up to it, but also the ensuing consequences. Just as Cuvier could reconstruct an entire animal from a single bone, so the observer who truly understands one link in a series of incidents can accurately predict all the others, both past and future. We haven't fully grasped the limits of pure reason. Problems that have stumped those relying on their senses can be solved in the confines of the study. However, to truly master this art, the reasoner must be able to utilize every piece of knowledge at their disposal. This, as you can see, implies possessing a vast reservoir of knowledge, a rare accomplishment even in our age of free education and encyclopedias. Still, it's not entirely impossible for a man to acquire all the knowledge relevant to his work, and I've endeavored to do just that. If I recall correctly, you, on one occasion during our early acquaintance, precisely defined my limitations. Yes, I laughed. It was a singular document. Philosophy, astronomy, and politics were marked at 0, I remember. Botany variable, geology profound as regards mud stains from any region within 50 miles of town, chemistry eccentric, anatomy unsystematic, sensational literature and crime records unique, violin player, boxer, swordsman, lawyer, and self-poisoner by tobacco. Those, I believe, were the main points of my analysis. Holmes grinned at the last item. "Well," he said, "I stand by what I said then. A man should fill his mental attic with the furniture he's likely to use, and store the rest in the lumber room of his library, ready for when he needs it. Now, for a case like the one before us tonight, we need to muster all our resources. Would you mind handing me the letter K of the American Encyclopedia? The one on the shelf beside you? Thank you. Now, let's analyze the situation and see what we can deduce. Firstly, we can confidently assume Colonel Openshaw had a compelling reason for leaving America. Men of his age don't readily change their habits and swap the pleasant Florida climate for the isolated life of an English provincial town. His extreme preference for solitude in England suggests fear of someone or something, so we can posit as a working hypothesis that fear was the driving force behind his departure from America. As for what he feared, we can only deduce it by examining the ominous letters received by him and his successors. Did you notice the postmarks of those letters? The first was from Pondicherry, the second from Dundee, and the third from London, from East London. What do you infer from that? They are all seaports. It implies the writer was on board a ship. Excellent, we have a clue. It's highly probable that the writer was aboard a ship. Now, let's consider another point. In the case of Pondicherry, 7 weeks passed between the threat and its fulfillment, while in Dundee it was only 3 or 4 days. Does that tell us anything? A greater distance to travel. But the letter also had a greater distance to cover. Then I don't see the significance. It at least suggests that the vessel carrying the man or men is a sailing ship. It seems they always send their unique warning or token ahead of them when they embark on their mission. Notice how quickly the deed followed the sign when it came from Dundee. If they had come from Pondicherry by steamer, they would have arrived almost as soon as their letter. But 7 weeks elapsed. I believe those 7 weeks represent the difference between the mailboat that brought the letter and the sailing vessel carrying the writer. It's possible? More than that, it's probable. And now you see the urgent nature of this new case, and why I advised young Openshaw to be cautious. The blow has always struck at the end of the time it would take the senders to travel the distance. But this one comes from London, so we cannot count on any delay. Good God! I exclaimed. What can it mean, this relentless persecution? The papers Openshaw carried are clearly vital to the person or persons on the sailing ship. I believe it's quite clear that there must be more than one of them. A single man couldn't have carried out 2 deaths in such a way as to deceive a coroner's jury. There must have been several involved, men of resource and determination. They are determined to obtain those papers regardless of who holds them. So, you see, KKK is not the initials of an individual, but a symbol of a society. But what society? Have you never, said Sherlock Holmes, leaning forward and lowering his voice, have you never heard of the Ku Klux Klan? I never have. Holmes flipped through the pages of the book on his knee. Here it is, he said after a moment. Ku Klux Klan, a name derived from the fanciful resemblance to the sound produced by cocking a rifle. This terrifying secret society was formed by ex-Confederate soldiers in the southern states after the Civil War, and it quickly established local branches across the country, notably in Tennessee, Louisiana, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. Its power was used for political purposes, primarily to terrorize black voters and murder or drive from the country those who opposed its views. Its outrages were usually preceded by a warning sent to the targeted individual in some fantastical but generally recognized form, a sprig of oak leaves in some areas, melon seeds or orange pips in others. Upon receiving this, the victim could either publicly renounce their former ways or flee the country. If they chose to stand their ground, death would inevitably follow, usually in a strange and unforeseen manner. So perfect was the organization of the society, and so systematic its methods, that there's hardly a recorded case where anyone successfully defied it with impunity, or where its outrages were traced back to the perpetrators. For several years, the organization thrived despite efforts by the United States government and the better elements of Southern society. Finally, in 1869, the movement abruptly collapsed, though sporadic outbreaks of the same sort have occurred since then. "You'll observe," said Holmes, closing the volume, "that the sudden dissolution of the society coincided with Openshaw's disappearance from America with their papers. It could very well be cause and effect. It's no wonder that he and his family have some of the most implacable spirits on their trail. You understand that this register and diary may implicate some of the most prominent men in the South, and that many may not sleep soundly until it's recovered." Then the page we saw is as we might expect. It read, if I remember correctly, "Sent the pips to A, B, and C," meaning sent the society's warning to them. Then there are subsequent entries that A and B cleared, or left the country, and finally that C was visited, with, I fear, a sinister outcome for C. Well, I believe, Doctor, that we can shed light on this dark matter, and I believe that young Openshaw's only chance, for now, is to do as I instructed. There's nothing more to be said or done tonight, so hand me my violin, and let's try to forget for half an hour the miserable weather and the even more miserable ways of our fellow men. The morning dawned clear, the sun shining with a subdued brightness through the haze that hangs over the city. Sherlock Holmes was already at breakfast when I came down. "You'll forgive me for not waiting for you," he said. "I foresee a very busy day ahead of me investigating this case of young Openshaw's." "What steps will you take?" I asked. "It will largely depend on the results of my initial inquiries. I may have to go down to Horsham, after all." "You won't go there first?" "No, I'll start with the city. Just ring the bell and the maid will bring up your coffee." As I waited, I picked up the unopened newspaper from the table and glanced at the headlines. One particular headline sent a chill through me. "Holmes!" I cried. "You're too late." "Ah," he said, setting down his cup. "I feared as much. How did it happen?" He spoke calmly, but I could see that he was deeply affected. "My eye caught the name Openshaw, and the headline Tragedy Near Waterloo Bridge. Here's the account. Between 9 and 10 last night, Police Constable Cook of the H Division, on duty near Waterloo Bridge, heard a cry for help and a splash in the water. However, the night was extremely dark and stormy, so that, despite the assistance of several passers-by, it was impossible to effect a rescue. The alarm was given, and, with the help of the water police, the body was eventually recovered. It proved to be that of a young gentleman whose name, as found in an envelope in his pocket, was John Openshaw, and whose residence is near Horsham. It is believed he may have been rushing to catch the last train from Waterloo Station, and that in his haste and the extreme darkness, he lost his way and walked over the edge of one of the small landing places for river steamboats. The body showed no signs of violence, and there is no doubt that the deceased was the victim of an unfortunate accident, which should prompt the authorities to address the condition of the riverside landing stages. We sat in silence for a few minutes, Holmes more depressed and shaken than I had ever seen him. "That hurts my pride, Watson," he said at last. "It's a petty feeling, no doubt, but it hurts my pride. It's become personal now, and if God grants me health, I will track down this gang. That he should come to me for help, and that I should send him to his death." He jumped from his chair and paced the room in uncontrollable agitation. His sallow cheeks flushed, and his long, thin hands nervously clasping and unclasping. "They must be cunning devils," he exclaimed at last. "How could they have lured him down there? The embankment isn't on the direct route to the station. The bridge, no doubt, was too crowded, even on such a night, for their purpose. Well, Watson, we'll see who wins in the end. I'm going out now." "To the police?" "No, I'll be my own police. When I've spun the web, they can catch the flies, but not before." I was occupied with my professional work all day, and it was late in the evening before I returned to Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes hadn't come back yet. It was almost 10 o'clock before he entered, looking pale and weary. He walked to the sideboard, tore off a piece of bread, and devoured it voraciously, washing it down with a long gulp of water. "You're hungry," I remarked. "Starving. It slipped my mind. I've had nothing since breakfast." "Nothing?" "Not a bite. I had no time to think about it." "And how have you succeeded?" "Well, you have a clue?" "I have them in the palm of my hand. Young Openshaw will not go unavenged for long. Why, Watson, let's use their own devilish trademark against them. It's well thought out." "What do you mean?" He took an orange from the cupboard, tore it apart, and squeezed the pips onto the table. From these he took 5 and put them into an envelope. On the inside of the flap he wrote, "S.H. for J.O." Then he sealed it and addressed it to Captain James Calhoun, Bark Lone Star, Savannah, Georgia. "That will await him when he enters port," he said, chuckling. "It might give him a sleepless night. He'll find it as sure a precursor of his fate as Openshaw did before him." "And who is this Captain Calhoun?" "The leader of the gang. I'll have the others, but him first." "How did you track it down, then?" He pulled a large sheet of paper from his pocket, covered with dates and names. "I've spent the entire day," he said, "poring over Lloyd's registers and files of old newspapers, tracing the subsequent career of every vessel that touched at Pondicherry in January and February of '83. There were 36 ships of fair tonnage that were reported there during those months. Of these, one, the Lone Star, instantly caught my attention since, although it was reported as having cleared from London, the name is the same as that of one of the states in the Union. Texas, I believe. I wasn't, and am not sure which, but I knew the ship must have American origins. What then? I searched the Dundee records, and when I found that the bark Lone Star was there in January, '85, my suspicion became a certainty. I then inquired about the vessels currently in the port of London. Yes? The Lone Star had arrived here last week. I went down to the Albert Dock and found that she had been taken downriver by the early tide this morning, homeward bound to Savannah. I wired to Gravesend and learned that she had passed some time ago, and with the wind being easterly, I have no doubt that she's now past the Goodwins and not far from the Isle of Wight. What will you do then? Oh, I have him in my grasp. He and the 2 mates, as I've learned, are the only native-born Americans on the ship. The others are Finns and Germans. I also know they were all 3 away from the ship last night. I got that from the stevedore, who was loading their cargo. By the time their sailing ship reaches Savannah, the mail boat will have carried this letter, and the cable will have informed the Savannah police that these 3 gentlemen are urgently wanted here on a murder charge. However, even the most meticulous of human plans often have flaws, and the murderers of John Openshaw were never to receive the orange pips that would have shown them that another, equally cunning and resolute, was on their trail. The equinoctial gales that year were exceptionally long and severe. We waited a long time for news of the Lone Star of Savannah, but none ever reached us. We did eventually hear that somewhere far out in the Atlantic, a shattered sternpost of a boat was seen bobbing in the trough of a wave, bearing the letters LS carved upon it, and that's all we'll ever know about the fate of the Lone Star. The end. If you like the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.